medical consultants, on medical consultant rotas. That was juicy, wasn't it? Have you seen that on the internet recently? Many people dropping me texts and DMs and stuff thinking, why are you not weighing in on this? This is what you've been going on about for ages. Multidisciplinary roles, and what does it mean to be, and what different certificates we all have, and competence and qualifications and stuff. They were expecting me to weigh in, and I'll admit now, I'll reveal to you why I haven't. It is purely because I lost my voice last week. That is literally the only reason. And so I wasn't going to write about it. My fingers get sore, don't they, if I type too much. So instead, I was waiting till I found my voice again. And now that all the dust has settled and the complete momentum has sucked out of the entire thing, here I am to weigh in on it. So for those that don't know, I've been sort of commenting on such things for a long time. Or, well, let's just frame the situation. There's a job advert that went out that was particularly controversial, where it suggested that a non-medical consultant was being recruited that would then sit on a consultant rota. I forget, it was in neuro, I think, wasn't it? It was like a stroke, acute stroke and stuff like that. But it provoked a really interesting conversation about quality, about competence and stuff, because of course any AHP that might be going into that role is going to be someone of repute, and that would then sit in a job description as a consultant AHP and consultant physio. And so then it became a very interesting conversation, whereby you got the best and worst of it, where the worst of it being that you've got people that are just massively disparaging about this being just a race to the bottom in terms of standards, and that this, that any physio or anyone in AHP were just morons compared to the mighty doctors. And then on the good side of it is that it provokes a conversation about, right, where are the thresholds for these things and stuff, and how do we make sure that we don't undermine our medical colleagues by advancing practice in various different AHP roles. And so there's good and bad parts of that debate. But the reason that I guess I'd weigh in on this, even though it's not close to my sector, that close to our sector in terms of MSK and stuff, is I've spoken for a long time about sort of competency-based recruitment, about the fact that it should matter less about specifically what discipline we qualify in, as long as we're competent to do the job. The interesting threshold is, of course, there is something to be said for the to be medical versus to be non-medical in terms of the detail that entails for what those roles are, and what assumptions can be made when someone is or isn't a medical doctor, particularly in the UK, let's say. And that is a really relevant threshold that should be respected and understood. And that's where it starts to fall away, is when people start to make points beyond that. There's an essence of what it is to be a doctor. Well, if they're meaning that they're more qualified, then the point can be proven fairly easily. Is a medical doctor more qualified than a non-medical therapist or other professional in a particular role? It depends what the role is, doesn't it? It depends on the job description. It depends on the devil's in the detail there. Amusing assumptions that some people have is that doctor just means good. It's just that there's a natural kite mark of quality is to be a doctor, and anything else than that is just less than. And some people feel that way. It's old school for my taste, and it seems a bit bizarre. I don't think it's a justifiable position by either experience or evidence these days. However, some people feel that way, and so it's doctor and then less than, and they just can't help but feel that way. Then there's others that are naive enough to think that the AHPs of any stripe or of a caliber or quality that a few competencies done, or a few lessons learnt, or a few shadowed clinics can make a therapist of any persuasion of a competence level of a doctor on any given task, or a set of tasks, or a job role, or the concept creep that comes from that means that then, why can't it just be, a doctor or working alongside a doctor like for like in terms of role and pay? And the lack of attention to detail on that is where it starts to get hairy, because that is, of course, a pretty bold claim, particularly because, and the key variable I find on this is that there's a massive difference in governance and a massive difference in education in terms of the standards that can be assumed from those qualifications and from the governance structure that exists around each of those roles. So, for example, in the UK, a medical doctor that qualifies has studied for 5 years under a very specific and somewhat grueling programme of education to then become a junior doctor. Now that usually then graduates you into a training post. Let's just be simple for now, in that it doesn't have to, I know that, but let's just say they take a training post and they go through medical rotations and go through being a junior doctor, F1, F2, SHO. I forget I might be a bit dated with my acronyms and stuff there, but a training post means that then they go through into being a registrar of a particular discipline, and lots of different routes in which they might go down in terms of whether they become more academic and research based and stuff. But let's just say they then qualify. Eventually, they are constantly then studying and being tested against various different grades of education, and you can question the quality of those thresholds and examinations and tests and the competency frameworks that exist around doctors on ward rounds, and you know, the quality of that can be challenged, but it exists, right? It's a structure that can be challenged because it exists, as does then the aspiration for them to be a consultant or a GP, if they went into general practice and primary care as a GP typically, or into secondary care. There's lots of different subspecialties within surgery and non-surgery parts of that profession, but they then take exams to become a consultant, and then would need to then do the classic job interviews in order to get consultant posts. Okay, so you've got this bilateral track of education and standards that have been set by often by various different royal colleges, as well as the GMC and others. And then you've got this other track, which is the act of getting employed, right? Education and employment as being two simultaneous almost checks on the governance side, as well as then what it means to be allowed legally and ethically to practice different, say, techniques or modalities, or to be responsible and to be insured for prescribing, for intervening, for your medical judgment to be considered valid, and for that to be secure. And so you've got that then happening. The reason I mentioned those two tracks on education and employment is that in my world, I'm a physiotherapist by background, for those that don't know, and in our world, the act of then getting a bachelor's in physiotherapy, which is a 3-year program, which does visit an array of different disciplines, from musculoskeletal, which is my world, through neuro, respiratory, pediatrics, etc., and we'll cover various different things there. But once that's done, I've not been, apart from voluntarily putting myself forward for various different bits and modules and exams, etc., I've then been otherwise untested. I've not been educated any further than that formally, and never assessed against that education since then. 10, 15 years ago. And so the only way in which my competence has ever been tested is on the employment side at job interviews. And so if I was to move forward into other more advanced practice roles, and say even if I was to try and take a consultant physiotherapy role in my side of the industry of MSK, then that would all need to be checked within the confines of a job interview or a recruitment process, let's say. It doesn't need to just be one interview. I know that these things can sometimes be several interviews, several rounds, several checks, several balances, references, etc. But that's the bilateral track I mentioned before with regards to medicine. Then also it fails to exist in the therapies game and in AHPs. And that is changing and it should be improving, and lots of people suggesting, myself included, as to how that might be better, but that is the fact. And so when people get carried away in thinking that the margin between, say, medicine and non-medicine in terms of quality as assurance by kite marks and standards and qualifications, etc., they are worlds apart at the moment in the UK, absolute worlds apart. Now, so there's some assumptions that can be made, and when people get really fiery about this, there's all sorts of reasons for it. But one of the most justified reasons that they could be pretty miffed is if people are implying that educational difference isn't there and isn't relevant. It's because it's just an absolute fact of the matter. If you find an individual that is heavily qualified with various different master's level and PhD level understanding, they've done all sorts of different medical qualifications or sort of sub-medical qualifications as a non-doctor, then that's them as an individual, well done. But they've chosen to do that. They've not had to do that to meet certain thresholds, right? That's out, absolutely out of choice. Whereas you've got a consultant in a particular medical discipline has gone through a process and within their Royal College has met a threshold by their peers to then become that grade. It's a different thing altogether than doing sort of voluntary modules of which you just pay for as part of a master's or a program. It's just not, it's a different world of it. So again, that's a shame. Now, that doesn't mean that I then justify some of the bizarre behaviour of sort of old school tribalism, whereby there's then some doctors and surgeons and stuff sort of sneering at non-doctors and surgeons and stuff. It's just so, unfortunately, you show yourself to be really quite old school in all the wrong ways, in that you're basically being raw tribal there, and it's something that can't be justified or can't be defended. As I've mentioned there before, I have some sympathies for some of the arguments that get made about the differing standards that can be made on assumptions and the lack of education pathways for non-doctors or non-medical consultants. It's annoying, and it's something that I think sometimes doesn't get talked about enough, because I think it's a bit of a best kept secret for some people. However, if you get carried away on a theme and therefore think that that's a justified reason for sort of sneering and laughing at anything that isn't a medical role, or to think that there's no justified reason as to why the health service might want to diversify roles within a sensible competency framework with qualified individuals to actually then aspire to roles that are well thought out, that don't necessarily need a medical qualification, then unfortunately you're showing yourself to be quite childlike in your thinking and logic, and to unfortunately putting yourself on more of a pedestal than you deserve, to think that there is a massively an essence that is to be a doctor that could never be, and in every task that means that then there's no competency that can be created that would mean you can be competent and qualified to do certain tasks, certain roles, and that for that to be not just safe but also effective and cost efficient for the health service that doesn't necessarily undermine what it is to be a medic. So very difficult situation. I saw that tempers were flared and emotions were running high and things like that. I'm not here to sort of pick at old wounds if they're starting to close on that. I know that I'm behind on this, but it was something that I got enough messages and DMs and all that sort of stuff to then put this together on request to just say what are my thoughts on it. And so I hope I've given you a bit of a range there. Classically for me, it's something that I'm irritated by various different extremes of the same conversation. Hope I've made sense as to what my take is, and I hope that therefore we can think what the solutions are almost naturally emergent from what I've just said. Getting quality education pathways through for those that are then wanting to aspire to a credible advancement of their practice within AHP land, and particularly in my world in MSK, is absolutely essential. I think that I cannot believe how slow we're being with that, but I know progress is being made, and I hope that that applies across into things like neuro examples, as is being made in this one with this stroke unit or what have you. I also think that then this better interprofessional conversation needs to be had, so that we can not make the mistakes of then indulging those that want to be really tribal on the medical versus non-medical side, but also have the maturity as AHPs and as physiotherapists to not feign offence at the fact that then any implication that we are as standard as a group, not necessarily on the same educational track and not having that weight of history that supports that sort of network system governance, feigning offence and saying how dare you, we're just as good and stuff. It's just absolutely pathetic of a different sort of kind, and we need to sort of grow up from that as well. So a massive amount of my both irritation and amusement across different parties when this has all been kicking off. We need to be thoughtful when we're advertising these posts as well. That's one of the big mistakes on this, is that how clumsy was it? Was it made clear what was and wasn't within the JD of this role? And that devil is in the detail, because if it's something that is an overreach for a non-medical role, then that is not smart, not safe, not wise. But if it's something that then was just a badly worded piece within a job description, and that actually this is a completely sensible consultant AHP role, of which then has been blown out of all proportion, partly by those that are just easily triggered as doctors for how dare you, that's only to be a doctor and we need to protect that at all costs, and you guys need to stay away from it because you're all stupid. Then okay, it's not going to help. So clumsiness from a HR level could well have contributed to a lot of this, and that's not something we need to have happen again. But it does provoke really interesting conversations of which need to be had across different disciplines, and for us to have the maturity to realise that the only way to take the pace off this ball is to communicate better and to really aspire to think what is better for patients, what is better for professions, and what is better for us all, to try and balance the workload sensibly so we can raise standards in healthcare together. So that's enough from me. Thank you so much for those that did send me a message, and sorry I've been a bit delayed in doing it. Lost my voice last week. That's my excuse, and I'll speak to you all soon on More Physio Matters. Take care.